for coming to our very early event. It's parallel to many other constituency meetings, but I'm glad that it's live streamed, and I think the live stream works, right? Yes. So our session today has very distinguished guests from very different backgrounds. We have science, spirituality, and practical actions on the ground, how to switch and connect knowledge, which is more local knowledge, practical knowledge, to scientific communities. We have an analyst of negotiations. And our topic today, transforming knowledge systems through ethical leadership, is a topic which is, first of all, quite big, but it actually relates to the initiative of the Brazilian presidency to call out the global ethical stocktake. And I was, when I came to the COP, really curious how this stocktake will be taken up here. And at the moment, for now, I haven't seen so much of it, but I know that the faith-based organizations have taken it up in a very beautiful way and had programs in the city, discussions about it every day. So I would like to start with Jeremy Dommnich to give his first perspective on the topic and share his standpoint.
Yes, good morning to all of you, and thank you, Caroline, for having me on this panel. I'm very curious to hear how our different experiences will form our views on ethical leadership. Maybe I will try to give a bit of background about myself and sort of then go into what my views are for this panel. So I spent most of my career in diplomacy, working at the UN in different political missions. And then I worked also in weaponized conflicts around the world, always focused on conflict and why people don't agree, right? And I think one of the ways how ethics is supposed to transform is because they are connectors, right? We can agree that we can share certain values. So in this sort of contrast between people disagreeing and people finding common sense, I found that when it comes to multilateralism, the realist perspective is still what prevails a lot of times. So when I speak to negotiators, it's mostly that either the powerful states are dictating the course forward, or the states that have the most resources. And I feel like the power element of multilateralism still supersedes ethical considerations. And why is that? You could say that, oh, is it because the individual negotiators, they are unethical people or they have the wrong values? No, it's because the mandate that these people are issued from their governments, from their agents, require them to act in a certain way. So if we're having a position where the representatives of countries have as a top priority to maximize the interests of their own country, then any kind of ethical considerations would come second to that. So for example, if you have a country where English is the first native language, and you are in a negotiation setting with somebody whose native language is not English, and you are trying to push forward a certain part of the text that is favorable to you, you are doing your professional duty as a representative, as a diplomat. Now, if you realize the ethical consideration that language is a barrier, right? That the correct understanding, and you know how climate texts are, there are a lot of times they use jargon, they use complicated wordings, right? If you as a negotiator realize that the counterpart is not aware that the current text is unfavorable to them due to resource constraints of actually checking the text, due to language constraints, due to other kind of constraints, then the ethical thing would be to point that out, to say, hey, have you actually read the text, and do you know how this will affect you? But as a negotiator, you will probably not do that, right? Same thing with other things. When we think of in negotiation theory, there's something like a term called constructive ambiguity. And constructive ambiguity means that we are using words and we are spreading them. Wow. We are amplifying the words in order for people to find themselves in a particular wording, right? A good example of that is just transition, right? Everybody can subscribe to the word just, but what it actually means when we go to the ground, when we go to implementation, then that looks very different for different kinds of actors, right? So whereas on text we're able to agree to the word just, all the relevant parties know that when we come to implementation, the word just will favor this side or favor the other side, right? So then ethics also becomes a sort of tool that is used to bring the text over the line and try to influence constituencies, influence audiences listening, right? Because when we then present the text outward, everybody can say, yeah, we have achieved a just transition, and that will go well with all of the populations across the world, right? So I'm very skeptical around ethical considerations in text. But at the same time, you see that ethics have found their way in the way how we talk about climate. So for example, common but shared responsibility, or the idea that polluters are paying more than non-polluters, right? These are deeply ethical considerations where we have seemed to found an agreement that this is how we want to go forward. Because in a very unethical world, we would say, no, actually all the countries have to pay the same things, etc., etc. So we are sort of stuck in between a realist world where only power dictates and resources dictates, whoever interests get served first. And on the other side, we see, and the SDGs are a very good example of that, the human drive for cooperation. And I feel like in that way, negotiators here on the ground are exactly in that paradox between collaboration, and you see deep friendships between the individual negotiators, but then on the other side, you see a very hard, cold sort of rationale that dictates some of the actual policies and tactics that are being employed. So I would say that if we want to talk about ethics in negotiation, there's something that's called an agreement in principle, right? So can we agree on a way how we want to negotiate? And one of the initiatives that has been discussed over the last years has been, for example, do we want to limit the amount of delegates that each country is able to send in order to make sure that we all have an equitable seat at the table, right? And even those initiatives until now have been blocked due to power interests, right? So for me, I would be very curious to see how can we find an agreement in principle, how can we find the ethical ground on which we are willing to negotiate and have these very difficult discussions in light of global power asymmetries and imbalances. And for me, that requires a certain type of psychological safety, especially if we talk about security interest and safety issues. Then we also need to talk about how individual safety of people can be warranted. You see, the Brazilian presidency has issued a statement that they want everybody to feel like they're in a safe space, that they want this to be therapy, and they want to have intimate letters. But you see that has been received, at least from what I have heard from negotiators, again, little more than sort of, dialectics, and not really something that has actually found its space into the very structure how we are negotiating, right? So if we want to create a safe space, if we want to have difficult discussions about ethics, which will then inform the outcomes, then I think we need to look at different ways on how we meet and how we discuss these issues.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was a powerful start. Handing over to Nsikan-George Emana and Mana.
Thank you. Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, everybody, for having me, and thank you, Caroline, for inviting me to this session. And thank you very much. I'm very glad to have the opportunity and privilege to sit with distinguished leaders like you. I take it up from where Jeremy left. So he says the power of multilateralism sort of subdues the role of ethics, and I do strongly agree with him. And from my point of view, when we talk about ethics in the space in the context of climate change, the damage and the scale and the depth of climate change is not it is not a problem that we should leave it to the whims and caprices of ethics to solve. Now we have defined and we have established ourselves as individuals, as a society, on the basis of ethical values and on principles. And we cannot dismiss the fact that we have gone many years ahead through the instrumentality of ethics and principles. But in a diverse world, and in a world that we are having global challenges like climate change, like HIV, AIDS, like health issues, ethics really cannot solve all the problems we need. Now, we started the journey with ethics and principles in 1992 during the Earth Summit here in Brazil. And over the last 20 years, it has been the word ethics and principles and values have been reoccurring in the text, in the negotiation text. It occurred in Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol. It occurred in a Paris Agreement text, ethics and principles. And it seems to always go and revolve around values, transparency, integrity and all that. But it doesn't really solve the magnitude of problems that we have. And I would think that we should, rather than relying on ethics and principle, we should look at climate change from a point of view that we need the markets, we need the regulations to force people to do certain things. Because if we leave the solutions of climate change to ethics, we wouldn't get to where we are today. So I see ethics playing a much more deeper role in terms of the code of conduct, in terms of compelling people, or in terms of appealing to the consciences of people during negotiations, like he said, but not in terms of changing the energy systems, and not in terms of bringing to a corrective measures the business and the market that brought us to the point where we are. So we need to scale, what is the scale of applicability of ethics in terms of climate change? Do we want to make ethics as a solution, or do we want to make it as a code of conduct in the roadmap that leads to, I see it more of a generational solution, that it should be part of the market, it should be part of other remediative solutions, but it shouldn't take a central role, because it can't solve the problem just by saying, I believe in law, I believe in ethics, I believe that things should be fair. I don't see it solving the problem. But I see it being like a code of conduct, like a generational consideration over time, that as we move on, he spoke about negotiations and how people use text and how people present arguments, but the implementations of these arguments and behind the text are not really the things we see thereafter. We have the experiences, we have been here since 2015 during the Paris Agreement. We are 10 years still caught up in negotiations. Ethics hasn't helped us to go that far, but at least it has helped the people, like in the Amazon, to have a voice. So I think we need more than ethics. So we need markets, we need regulations, we need businesses to respond and to own up to their responsibilities of what they have caused. That is my take on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very clear statement, questioning the power of ethics. And I wonder, at one point in our conversation, we really have to define what each of us means by ethics and practical implementation. I'm very happy to now hear from Sister Jayanti, who is I would say, very ethical leader.
Thank you. Can you hear me above the wonderful music that's coming through? Okay. From a spiritual perspective, I'd like to define how I see values and virtues and ethics. So values, I would say, are the inherent quality that every single soul has, which means that every soul has goodness, every soul has kindness, and the 5 integral, intrinsic values of every soul are peace, love, truth, joy, and purity. And the problem arises when we move away from that consciousness of our spiritual identity and we focus only on the physical identity. And in terms of physical identity, yes, of course, there are 1,000 different things that divide us and separate us. But if we were to come back to a spiritual consciousness and come back to the awareness of the inner being that I am, then I would also recognize the value of every single human being, and my relationship, not just with human beings, would change, but those values carried through in my life would also be the virtues I follow in my life. For example, if my value is the value of peace, and I put it through into my real life, my day-to-day activity, it would mean that there is non-violence, which means do no harm to anything, anyone. And so even to destroy a table, well, that's also doing harm. But think about it more in terms of how we treat the planet. The plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and the human kingdom. And you can see that because we've forgotten our spiritual identity, we've forgotten that peace is there inherent within us, and what we have to do is to remember who we are so that peace can manifest as non-violence in our life as a virtue. Things have gone very, very astray. But the third aspect, and that is the whole subject of ethics. And if I'm aware of my values, if I'm aware of my virtues, then, and I'm using those virtues in my life, then ethics is what relates to the external systems that we have created. And so whether it's in governance, whether it's in terms of nature, the ecology, the environment, just thinking about this concept of non-violence and taking it further. If there's an awareness of do no harm, yes, there can be a governance in which there's a very active opposition, but it would be to make things better, not simply out of ego for a further position or to claim power or the manifestations of power in terms of monetary value and so on. It would be a very different type of governance if there's this basic concept of peace and do no harm. And for example, when it comes to the environment, you can see definitely if we start with that as a premise, that this is the ethic for humanity, there would be a very different situation of the world. And we wouldn't be in the state of chaos and total breakdown that we are. In terms of negotiations, I'd just like to throw in one. We no longer a little bit of a shift to an open heart and a warm heart to be able to see that we're all in the same boat. And if water is coming into one side of the boat, it's going to reach my ankles pretty soon. And actually, that's what's already happened. It's not a vision of the future. It is the reality scenario of today. When it's time for floods to come, when it's time for fires to come, there's no boundaries, there's no distinctions. It's happening across the world. Then what gets reported is the upside-down, topsy-turvy ethics, where I was in India and just recently, and there were floods in Orissa. And I did not see a single mention of it on the BBC. I mentioned the BBC by name to tell you that that's what I was looking at. Zero mention of anything happening in India. And yet, of course, Hurricane Melissa had huge coverage. And so again, you can see where there's the ethic of one family, one home, one world, and we were to put that as the priority in front of us and think about the globe, not just my little patch on this planet Earth that's scarcely visible from up there, from the stars, from the satellites. So I think that if truly we were to come back to that consciousness that we are a spiritual family, we are a family here in reality, we share the same values intrinsically, then there's no problem. But the journey from coming back to materialism, consumerism, and control issues and money issues and power issues, back to that consciousness is the journey we have to be ready to travel on. And unless we're ready to do this, how do we see the world? How long is it going to take, not just for the water to reach our ankles, but the water to reach our nose? It's not going to be very long.
Thank you, Sister Jayanti, for this passionate talk on ethics and values. Professor Chen, please take your statement.
Thank you. So I would like to start with that the ethics is necessary, and although it's alone, it will not manage or solve all the problems, but it is absolutely necessary in my view, because we are living in a world where we have different values, different perceptions, different needs, different desires, and if we don't agree on that, I think it would be very difficult for me to think about any negotiation would be meaningful. And we also understand that Jeremy's view that in negotiation is a real word. It's difficult, but I think if we still need the ethics as a guidance. In my view, we already have some ethic principles that we have agreed to. I'm happy to hear that the Brazilian presidency said they will have a stock take on how this kind of things has been implemented. And for example, just give you one simple example that we have this thinking about the historical responsibility. It's amazing as a researcher, you hardly find papers or studies on that. It's very few, very few. And when I talk to my Western colleagues, they always say, oh, that's history. Let's move on, just look at what's happening. But we know that science tells us it is a cumulative emission from the industrialized nations that cause the problem. If we cannot respect that fact, if we cannot consider this ethically, I don't think we can move forward. That's my first point. My second point is that we need to have align the author systems such as governments, institutions, policies with people's value. Because if you don't align these two, we will not be successful. And we know that the consumption, for example, if we continue the consumption as we do, and if we still value this hugely as we do, we'll not be there. And we have some basic needs, but I think that we are living really in a world that part of the world usually overconsumes. So these are values I know, but I think we do need to look at these values and behaviors. Even you have a very good policy or good government makes right decisions. If people is not really have a value that corresponds to these policies, it will not help. So my second view is really that we need to work on hard to make sure that we both working at the highest level on ethics, but also on the bottom level on individual values, and to challenge ourselves, and challenge ourselves also in an ethical way. For example, we have to really think everybody is equal. Everybody is equal, and equal, yeah. And we don't take this as granted, actually. We make a lot of statements assuming that not everybody is not equal. And so I think, so we still have a long way to go to really look at the values, the behavior also, the human behavior at the individual level. And I'm happy to see that even within IPCC, to which I'm a coordinating lead also, and also IPES, the biodiversity organization, IPCC-like organizations, have really taken up this behavior and value things in the discussions. But I think we need to do much more. And I hope also we see that happening in the negotiation, but I know it's very difficult. But this is really pessimistic if we don't think governments can agree. Governments can only start from their own national interest. Then that will be very difficult. So I think I'll stop here, looking for the discussions with all of you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. I see different worlds coming together here, which usually probably would not talk to each other or even want to understand each other. And I'm just seeing the development in science or in research from science has to be, it can't be normative, it needs to be descriptive. You can have a personal stand as a scientist. And in recent years and in the work which I have been connected to with the Research Institute for Sustainability and Transdisciplinarity, there is an understanding or a statement where scientists more and more say, no, we have values, we have a certain standpoint, we are per se not objective, we are human beings. And I think this is a very hopeful development in research to admit to that. And I think this is happening in all sectors, also in politics. And of course, if I'm not, if I'm employed by someone who expects me to a position, to negotiate a position which is not my position, that's anyway, I think, very challenging situation. But where do you see the way forward to bring these different worlds of normativity together with the processes and systems which we have created, which are so split and divided from the personal or from an ethical standpoint?
Yeah, directly coming to the solution is maybe a bit quick, right? I would just like to maybe open up the floor for our discussion and put 3 questions that came into my head when you were speaking. So, Nsikan, you are working in compliance, right? And I was thinking, isn't the very idea of compliance the absence of trust? If I need to force you to do things, it means I don't trust you that you will do it on your own behalf. So what is the ethical consideration then that we are implying when we are saying we want to force parties, companies, people to act in a sustainable way? Which kind of ethics are we then employing? And then for Sister Jayanti, my question was, you said that we all have a good heart and that this is sort of the starting point from where we should have these discussions and from where we should act. And I agree. I think everybody wants to be a good person. I don't think anybody on this world would like to see themselves as unethical. But I feel like, or I would like to hear your views on how can we prioritize certain values. And I would like to, I think the discussion around ethics has is in danger of going into the very abstract and to make it very concrete. All of your countries I could use as an example, but I would not. So I would use the country of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a Caribbean island, and they are, of course, highly vulnerable to effects of climate change. But at the same time, their economy largely depends on oil exports. So then when we talk about ethics, what is more important now? Is it to invest in climate or to save the livelihoods of already a country that is not rich, where the people are not living lavishly? So then which of these ethical considerations do we then take forward? And how do we do that with a good heart? And then for Professor Chen, my question would go in the similar direction. How do we make sure that if we are saying we want ethics to play a role in science, how do we prevent it from being politicized? I feel like a lot of the discussions around science, whether it's in contemporary news or even in this forum, has or derails when it becomes politicized. So how do we balance science and ethics in a way that we still keep everybody on board? These will be like questions, and maybe from there we could like continue the discussion. You don't have to answer, but these were at least in my head.
Can I already answer?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Please. It's open conversation amongst us now.
Yes. So the mention of these two words, compliance and ethics, would quickly put across a message of distrust. Because when you ask the question, why do we need compliance if we are ethical? And it sends the message across to the listener that there is a distrust and a suspicion between these two worlds. And what I want you to understand, that compliance in the climate solution space is actually in the context of targets, of objectives, and of goals. So we are not complying in a non-contextual space. The compliance is within the framework of a certain goal. So I put up a goal. For example, in the carbon market, we have requirements, the rules, the procedures, and modalities for a carbon project to be designed, to be developed, to be implemented, monitored, verified, validated, and issued. And therefore, if you're coming into the carbon market space as a participant, then you need to comply, and that's where the compliance comes in. So it comes in within the context of a framework, of a target, of an objective, or of a goal, and not outside of a void. So that is, I would answer your question that way, so that we don't miss this link of, or increase that suspicion and distrust between ethical considerations and compliance in the carbon market space. I have a last comment, and I'll leave it until the other speakers would have made their comments.
There can always be short-term views and short-term goals, but there has to be also the long-term goal. And the long-term goal I'm thinking about is the future of civilization, the future of our planet, the future of humanity. And if I take only the consideration of economic development as the goal, then I'm going to miss out on the bigger picture and not be able to move in that direction. I know Trinidad and Tobago very well. I had gone there first in 1975 December and spent a few weeks there, living there with local people and sharing ideas of meditation. And through the years, I've regularly visited there. And yes, I've seen it move from an island that was pretty comfortable and happy, and people had a vision of equality and dignity, and now it's become a very different state of chaos. And yes, I understand the value of money and the value of moving the economy forward also, but I think when I realize that there's something bigger at stake, then I can't say that I can justify fossil fuels. There are alternative fuels, there's renewable energies that have come a long way since the early days. It's very affordable, it's not as expensive as fossil fuels actually anymore, but also we need to have the will to be able to make that transition. And the transition and transformation that we mentioned earlier isn't going to happen just simply by quoting figures of the economy. It's going to happen through a change of awareness, a change of consciousness, and through that change, yes, transformation of my views, my perspective, and coming back to my original values, which are actually the same. And if I were to try and prioritize values, then I would say that the starting point is peace. The starting point of the Sustainable Development Goals is again peace. You start with peace, but in order to have peace, then you've got all these other things that you have to achieve. And without that, peace isn't possible. But peace is the vision that we hold, that makes us do all of these other things so that we move in that direction. And so yes, economic development is fine, but not at the expense of destroying our planet and life and humanity. So I think that there's a very strong case there. I happen to know Trinidad and Tobago, so it was good you gave that example.
Okay, very good question, Xiaomi, from you. And I try to answer about to avoid the science be taken or be politicized. So first, I would like to start with values, because people who are doing science, they have values. They are individuals. Quite often they have different background, politically and also culturally. So I think each and every scientist is kind of biased. So we have to, that's also, I think there is maybe an interesting point that even scientists have different values. So there is some subjectivity. But what we should strive at is the objectivity and universality of science, because we do believe there is only one truth. And how to do that? I think number one is that we have to really to make sure every scientist is aware of that and try to think about that all the times. And from institution side, we have to really support the principle of universality of science, which I'm very honored to be, I was lucky to be in the position to have done something in that area when I was executive director of International Science Council in Paris. One of our activities is really that, and to make sure that every scientist has a right, equal right to do the science, but also to strive at the objectivity of science. Even we do that, but it's difficult because different values, as I mentioned before. That's why I was thinking that a high-level ethics is very important to agree on. And for example, we mentioned some of this. Transparency is another one when we thought about this compliance and so on. Even we check or we do stock take, but it's not just we don't trust people, but we want to have this transparency that everybody is treated equally. To me, these are ethic principles. And how to do that on a larger scale? I think IPCC is a very good example. That the IPCC, so we talking about the trust, we probably cannot trust one single scientist, but we should trust IPCC because this is a group of people. It's also an interesting process. We do agree on many things, but sometimes we do have disagreement within IPCC. But we finally can, after many discussions, objective, scientific validations, and so on, we still can agree on many things. So I think that is the power of I hope that the negotiation also follows that pattern. Because with scientific community, I think relatively speaking, we have it easy to agree on certain issues because there is only science. There's also so-called peer pressure, because within scientific community, if you really want to take an unscientific way, then you'll be nobody will trust you anymore in science. But interestingly, in politics, you can say whatever you want to say. You can do a lot of very unethical things. People still have to rely on you because you're powerful. So I know this is a difficult word. But for science, I think we should also try to follow the principle that we are policy relevant, but we should not be policy prescriptive. This is because I think this is exactly the IPCC's principle. Why is that? Is that we know that science is clear and also quite often have very clear conclusions. But in reality, when we implement some of the ideas from science, we have to respect there are many other considerations in society. We have to consider many other aspects. That's the job of the politicians. So I think we should not be politicized. We should use a group wisdom in science to help politicians to negotiate, to implement the ideas.
Thank you for giving that example that amongst you also don't agree several times, but you find a way to come together what is maybe the base of which is able to bring you together, that you come to an agreement? Are these certain, you said the principles, ethics or values which are so fundamental, maybe, which has the power to bring you together, or is it just you have to get this report done and it's at a certain deadline?
No, I think, for example, I'll just give you one example. In terms of the selection of people who are writing the IPCC report, basically, principally, we say that we should choose the best scientists in the world. But we know that in certain continents, the science is behind other continents because of capacity, history, and so on. But we still select people there. Why is that? Because we live in this universality. Also, we believe in the value of different knowledge system and the regional perspectives. So I think everybody in IPCC agrees. We still, need to have people from different continents, and although their science never.
And is it maybe, Jeremy, because a question to you, because we are talking on very different contexts here. I mean, the scientific, and you are very much we talked about a negotiation context where these values obviously are not so aligned, or there isn't a strong base. Do you see any possibility to translate a common ground into that field as well?
Yes, I think so, and thank you, Professor Chen, also for highlighting that. I would say that when we talk about ethics, there's a tendency to think about cultures, right? That my culture has different ethics or different values than yours, and that is true, but there's also a significant overlap, right? So if you, for example, take the value of motherhood, right? Mothers are seen and valued very similarly across a wide variety of cultures, right? So rather than focusing on different cultures and nations, I think what's interesting is to look at ethics of different kinds of actors in this space. So what is the ethics of a negotiator? What are the ethics of a minister? What are the ethics of the scientific community? And to find common bases across those levels, I think that will be more fruitful, because you have a shared experience together, you have a shared working surrounding together, right? And then to start from there, right? And I feel like a lot of negotiators here, actually, they have a very strong ethical ground, right? I think where it becomes difficult is when it comes to the political level, just because there's a lot more political complexities around there. So I think working on the political level, I think, is the most difficult. But also coming towards leadership, I think that's also where different grassroots communities, NGOs, they can then provide leadership to bring in those ethics, to bring in those considerations into their national context, which will then, of course, inform the kind of decisions that ministers around the world are taking, right? So I think if we want to bring ethics in, I think looking at it more, let's say, cross-professionally rather than on cultures, I think that will be definitely one step we could take.
Just a quick follow-up question on that, because you mentioned culture and the identification with it. So it's actually also an identification question. How do I see myself relating to what Sister Jayanti has said before myself?
Yes, so our research that we are currently conducting here is also going into that. So what is actually the we? Are people experiencing themselves more, like Sister Jayanti said, as we as humans are trying to do things, or we as in my negotiation delegation, my nation? And I do think there's a lot of difficulty around like creating these overlapping kinds of identities, because they are regional, they are local, they are cultural, and so I think creating the spaces to foster a bigger meaning of we and to harmonize the different conflicts around overlapping identities, I think that's a step for facilitators. That's a step for any kind of panel, any kind of space that we are operating here, is to create a common shared sense of purpose around the people that are in the room.
Thank you. Sikim, would you like to?
We need to acknowledge ethics And we also need to recognize the limit to what it can do in terms of transformational change. And that thinking is connected to the fact that the neglect of ethics, of values, of principles, we neglected it, and it has brought us to this point where we are. Rather than, we also need to promote ethics, but rather than promoting ethics in isolation, I would say, let us promote ethics with responsibility. So we rather say we should be more responsible in the way we conduct our businesses, in the way we manage the affairs of governments, of climate change management and administration. So the word responsibility should go in tandem with ethics rather than having ethics as a standalone, because there is a limit. We need to acknowledge that there's a limit to what ethics can do when it comes to the solutions of climate change. The scale is steep.
May I jump in there, just because I wanted to come to that in your first speech also. Is it that it's also about my relationship to ethics and how I understand values? Because the way you talk about it, it sounds to me like an instrument, or like an approach which I can use for something, and not a personal relationship to it.
It is not an instrument, and it goes back to what Jeremy said from the beginning. There are the power of multilateralism. There are conditions and situations in which we find ourselves that the instinct, the ethical instinct and considerations in us is being overwhelmed, perhaps by political considerations, perhaps by in a position where you have to do certain things in a certain way, and then you lose this connection and this guard. You lose your sense of it is not as an instrument. It should be part of us. But in terms of trying to find a solution to a complex topic like climate change, and then you are torn between using ethics, is it as an instrument or as an embedded trait of the human body in evolving the society. So in climate change, we have to be very clear. There is a limit to what ethical considerations can help in the transformation and in the solutions of climate change. We need engineering. She talked about renewable energies. Renewable energies are technologies. They are scientific way of approaching a system that has been damaged, not an ethical way of approaching things that has been damaged. So I think this is where we need to cross to keep that boundary between how much can we achieve with ethical considerations and how much can we achieve with real business, regulatory, scientific solutions.
We are coming to the final part, and I wonder if others have questions to each one of you on what we have discussed so far. Do you have questions to each other, or would you like to just further the conversation? And also, in the meanwhile, we got a few more people listening. If you would like to jump in, please feel free to do so.
I just want to make a statement about ethics further. And it feels as if where even 50 years ago, so in my younger days, I would see leaders behaving following a set code of conduct, principles, and there was an ethics. And say, for example, if it was known that things had gone astray, things had gone awry under their leadership, there would be resignation and they would resign. And today that's no longer the case. We even have situations where it's absolutely evident that the leader is not the person with ethics, is only considering money, and yet again and again that person gets elected. And so it feels as if the whole subject of ethics has become so diluted or so forgotten that we are in a world in which we no longer have those values being expressed or the ethics being followed. And so my understanding of all of this is that we've really lost track of our spiritual identity. And I'm sorry to be bringing back this again into the picture, but I really do think it is somebody said recently that the only way out of all our problems is to go in. And I think that that's true, that when we go on that inner journey and reconnect with our own original values, then we're going to, that transformation is going to actually lead to transformation within the general ethos of our society, the world at large. And you're going to find ways to make all of these things happen. Without that inner change, it's not possible to achieve any of these. Even one single aspect of the SDGs are not going to be achieved.
And I just want to bring in again what you said, Sikin, that when you questioned in the very beginning the power of ethics and values, and you said we do need instruments, maybe carbon in the carbon market, for example, or rules and that force people to do things in a certain way. But it hasn't been really successful either. People find a way around it if there isn't a shift on a deeper level. So how do we combine these different approaches, wanting the same? Yes, please.
So
Do you want to?
I try to say a few words about the peace, and it has been mentioned. Personally, I believe two things are important. Number one is really peace. And we really want to make sure we don't need to go to war. And this is something we quite easily forget, and we start again and again. And of course, you might be saying how we can do that. And also for the sustainable development. So I wish, I know this is really idealistic, but I wish we have a stronger UN. Because a lot of times we have only the national interest, the economic interest that is at play. Then you have this power issue, etc. So I really wish we can work on the value that we believe there is only one Earth. We need to have a stronger government instance to govern the international environment. The only candidate is the UN, I think. So that is my hope, but I know this is very difficult at this moment.
I would have a question to Sister Jayanti. So we are talking here we have the privilege of being here, and I think when we talk about ethics, one way or one key step is empathy, right? So my question to you would be in two scenarios. One, you are meeting the ministers of the different participating countries, arguably some of the most powerful people that will be here. So I imagine you are speaking to them about exactly this topic, and what would you advise them to do, given the fact that they have their constraints and their considerations. And in the second scenario, you are meeting somebody, let's say in a country, and they are struggling to feed their family, and they tell you, yeah, I work in a polluting industry because part of my core ethics is to feed my family. And I cannot stop this job because I cannot have other options. So how would you talk differently to a council of ministers and a workers' union of a oil factory in a developing country?
Okay, firstly, the ministers. I think I would say to the ministers, you must keep the larger picture in mind, because what is going to be happening to one country is not the consequence that we want, but it's going to be actually everything that's going to be involved. And so you have to find a way of conveying this message to your people so that it's not taken as something that's not viable, but they begin to understand that this is actually the only viable way forward. And in terms of the individual, I would say to the individual, yes, it's important for you to serve your family and take care of them, but it's also important for you to create a society of peace. Your family is not safe, your family is not secure unless there is peace in the world. And peace in the world is only going to come when we are following a code of conduct that is acceptable to all.
If I can ask a follow-up, like if I'm now in the position of that minister, I would say, I totally agree with you, we need to have the bigger picture in mind, but what should I do now? Should I sign off to, if let's say I'm from Germany, should I sign off to, I don't know, 500 billion in climate financing? Should I sign that? Or should I sign something else? On all of these different topics, whether it's technology transfer, climate financing, loss and damage, adaptation, they are very concrete questions and very concrete decisions that need to be taken. So what would you advise them to do concretely? And same thing with the other person. Would you advise them to stay in the job or quit the job? I feel like, again, we are sort of drifting into abstract, but people need to make concrete choices.
I think it is possible for ministers to say that I have to support climate change in a positive way, so that then we're not taking the temperatures to the state that it's already reached, because within the next few years we're going to see more trouble. If you calculate how much money is already being spent in terms of repair work after a hurricane, it's running into billions and maybe even trillions. It's not in millions anymore. So I think that if you actually do the sums properly, you can justify supporting things that can help the climate rather than create more trouble. And yes, I would say to the person who's concerned about their family, if you follow the dictates of your conscience, there will always be something that you can do that's honest and yet also supportive of life.
I think it's a matter of trust also, which is coming up. Trust in what I would call truth, but truth is a word which is not very popular in certain areas. My inner truth, my inner sense of feeling. Let's have a closing comment from everyone. We are already in the end, but I think a minute is okay to have. And thank you very much for engaging in this conversation. We already had to take leave from Professor Chen, but you're still here, so hear from you.
Yes, so I started off by saying that ethics don't play a role in the realist perspective of international relations, where power governs everything. I do now see that, you know, implementing ethics in text and in conversations, trying to always push towards the boundary of ethics, I think that's the way to go, that everyone should exploit their space for action towards the maximum ethical behavior. And wherever that space is, whether it's here or whether it's in a different position, I think that's great. And for me, it always starts with empathy and understanding everybody's trying to do the ethical thing. It's just about which ethics are being prioritized right now. That is the challenge still for me.
Thank you. I appreciate the knowledge I have learned from the colleagues who spoke, but my message is very clear, that ethics should be taught in a code of conduct. It should be used more of a generational solution rather than a transformational solution, rather than a concrete activities. So we need concrete activities, finance, he mentioned, we need concrete activities with new technologies, we need concrete activities in taking concrete decisions. But even while doing this, we should also have at the back of our minds that we need to have ethical considerations. I would promote the word responsibility in tandem with ethics. Then I would say ethics would do everything. It can do everything in the scale of damage that we are in climate change. The successes has been quite incremental, and we will be seeing successes as we go on. So I do appreciate your viewpoint, but we need to take concrete actions. Thank you.
I want to thank Jeremy for throwing the stone in the pond and making the ripples reach out and make everyone think. I appreciate that greatly. And from my side, I just like to say that deep in our hearts, we know that goodness always wins. Thank you.